not point fingers backward.
I took American history. Didn't sound so bad to me.
You gotta be kidding me. It was 150 years?
Come on. That was so long ago. I had nothing to do with it.
They didn't give us any 40 acres and a mule. They threw us out there. So coming from a state of dependency, saying now function. When you had no track record of functioning in the society, and then where you had to cope with discrimination of their preventing you to function independently, right? To establish yourself, to get control, to start businesses, to achieve, they were blocking you from doing that very actively. Again, reinforcing the message sometimes, so you had black people saying, well, if we were just good enough, you know, we could make it, when actually that was just sometimes impossible. So there's no question in my mind that today that black Americans are still suffering many of the ill effects, serious ill effects of the slave experience and the Jim Crow segregation experience.
Had black people received the 40 acres and a mule that they requested in 1865, plus the right to bear arms to protect their land, and the right to have universal education, they fought to build schools, the history of race relations in the United States would have been completely different. You might not have had to have a civil rights movement 100 years later, because with economic development and the right to control land, create your own businesses, and with universal education, African Americans could have become full equal partners in the society with white Americans.
Nobody disputes the horror of slavery. To locate that act in a particular time frame and say that it has no influence in the present, I think is illogical. My response then is the legacy of slavery is still with us. Slavery didn't stop because 1865 somebody signed a piece of paper, but the legacy continues.
I wanted to be an attorney when I was growing up. I couldn't go to Duke's Law School, University of North Carolina, not because I could not have dealt with the academics, but primarily because of the color of my skin. And so as an African American, we've experienced not only the legacy of slavery in terms of our ancestors, but even 100 years after slavery. When you look at, for example, all the barriers that was placed in the path of blacks after slavery, black codes, sharecropping, for example, discrimination, all the segregated systems in this nation.
We don't serve mixed trade. And I said, what do you mean you don't serve mixed trade? I said, you just served that lady that was in front of me. That's how naive I was. I didn't understand, you know, what he meant. So the guy in the kitchen was a black guy. And he said, come here, girl. So he had to take me in the kitchen to explain to me why they wouldn't serve me. They wouldn't serve me because I couldn't eat or drink on the premises. I was devastated. I was so hurt. I think that was really my first taste of racism, and I think it was from that point on that I wanted to be active and, you know, and do something about, you know, being treated fairly, you know, having black people being treated fairly. Of course, I wouldn't eat any place else in Maryland after that. I was just afraid. I didn't know where I could sit down and eat and where I couldn't. And this was in the 60s. It was like 1964, you know.
But every social scientist who has studied the African American condition in this country will tell you that the barriers of race that keep health care, equal access out of the black community, that make our hospitals inferior, that when black people and white people are diagnosed with the same heart disease problems, that black people, on average, with white physicians, will receive less invasive kinds of intensive care than whites. And again, I'm not making this up. There are all kinds of scientific studies and surveys that prove this.
That for 250 years of slavery, 2.5 centuries, they drilled into black people's heads that they were inferior people and that their lives were not worth much because they could demonstrate it by killing them at will, lynching them, brutalizing them, whipping them, exploiting them in every way, so that lives didn't count for much. And to consider that this feeling of inferiority is still something that many black people are trying to overcome today in the 21st century. That's been one of our biggest psychological problems, is feelings of inferiority, feelings of a lack of self-worth because we're black, struggling to overcome that, sometimes internalizing racism so that we actually acted against ourselves. We got caught up in the hierarchy of white supremacy around light skin and dark skin, and persecuted people in our own group and rejected them who were darker, and often celebrated people who were lighter, so that we became internally in some ways racist ourselves, which then is damaging to us psychologically in terms of overcoming feelings of inferiority, or feeling the only way we would be in some way to become white people, which of course was impossible.
I didn't make any money off the slaves.
Well, the people who profited are
All the slave
gone.
owners are dead. Finito.
I didn't even have anything to do with it.
There's no slaves alive today.
My ancestors didn't own slaves.
So it doesn't matter whether you came here last night, and it doesn't matter whether your ancestors had anything to do with it whatsoever. Once you become a citizen of the government of the United States of America, just as you have inherited the wealth of that government and all that it supplies you, you must also inherit the debt.
The taxes that went into the government coffers just on cotton alone was just enormous, just millions and millions of dollars. And this is what built the infrastructure of this nation, were taxes on slavery.
Reparations is a debt owed for free labor, for building the economy and the infrastructure. It is a debt owed here in New York City. From 1625 to 1827 was slavery in New York City, up south, right here in New York City, slavery. Our people came over here when the Dutch called it New Amsterdam, stole Africans from Africa and the Caribbean. We built the infrastructure of New York. Wall Street is named after the wall that Africans built. The stock market, we were the human stock on the stock market being exchanged. Cotton came from the South to New York before it headed out to Europe to be sold. Brooklyn was all forest. Manhattan was forest. Queens was forest. My ancestors leveled the field, leveled the forest so that they can cultivate the land for food and roads and bridges and homes. We built that only to be murdered, raped, and brutalized.
Why should I pay? I didn't do anything, you know. Well, what we are requiring, at least people with whom I'm involved, is that the government and corporate America pay. The reason is that they participated in the slavery, they participated in the continued exploitation, thievery. They were a part of a marriage that in many ways, conspicuously, blatantly sometimes, subtly sometimes, but in many ways of keeping a people subjugated.